Those that are new here, this is our weekly conservation sciences seminar hosted through Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. We host this seminar and invite a variety of different speakers to come and talk about their different aspects of their work that they would like to present on. This week, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Robert Lee from the who's a fellow at the Selwyn College at the University of Cambridge and is a lecturer in American history. He'll be talking today about his investigation into the Morrill Act of 1862. A little housekeeping on how today's seminar will work. Dr. Lee will give his talk, and then there should be a little time at the end for question and answer session. Feel free to type your questions into the chat over the course of the talk, and we'll get to that. If you'd prefer at the end, you can also feel free to unmute yourself and ask them out loud. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Wes, and thanks to Nick for inviting me. One of the unexpectedly great things to come out of this piece that I'm going to tell you about today, for me, has been the opportunity to talk with a lot of different audiences that I normally wouldn't be interacting with as a historian. So I've spoken at law schools, spoken at medical schools. I've spoken to audiences of historians, but this is the first time with a conservationist science group. So I'm excited to get some different perspectives on this piece and the research. So thank you for the introduction. I'm grateful to be able to round out my week here talking about land grab universities. Let me share my screen here. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you see the presentation there? Okay, excellent. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, creating what was a nationwide land grant university system. What the act did was it distributed public domain land to either establish or to aid colleges across the United States. Now, these are thriving universities today. The University of Minnesota is one of them. But these universities have seldom asked who paid for their grants and their good fortune. And not asking that question has become something of a national pastime in the United States. Just a few months ago, at the Biden inauguration, when Vice President Harris, in her inauguration speech, she celebrated how, quote, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln saw a better future and built it with land grant colleges and the Transcontinental Railroad. But behind the myth of effortless prosperity, of endowment manna from heaven that surrounds the land-grant university system, lies a huge wealth transfer masquerading as a donation. The Morrill Act of 1862 worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into endowments for higher education. In all, the act redistributed about 11 million acres. That's an area about the size of Denmark or Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island combined. If you lop off Cape Cod there, you can imagine that sort of square of land. That's about the size that we're talking about in total, but it wasn't an area in total. This landmass was broken up into almost 80,000 parcels that were scattered across 24, mostly Western states. According to federal records, the land came from about 250 tribal nations. It was acquired by the United States through more than 160 land cessions, mostly coerced sales, but often uncompensated outright takings, as was the case in places like California. Now, the money raised from the land provided land-grant universities with the equivalent of about $500 million in today's money, at a time when these colleges were tiny and just starting out. It was seed money for the land-grant university system. Now, this investigation, Land Grab Universities, tracked how the Morrill Act turned indigenous land into college endowments. We identified nearly every acre obtained and sold, every land seizure or treaty made with the land as indigenous caretakers, and every dollar endowed with profits from this dispossession as principal and endowments for these universities. So that's the project that I'm going to be talking about today. And what I'd like to do first is sort of start by giving you some background on the project and provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to investigating it. The indigenous sources of university land has been a major emerging issue really in the last 5 years or so. And the springboard has been studies of slavery and the university that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, have read about it in journals or in newspapers. This is really the sort of font out of which these questions about indigenous land being used by universities emerged from. So you could see this starting to pick up in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's published in 2014. She flags the issue of the Morrill Act. There have been cultural theorists like K. Wayne Yang, who discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university from a sort of theoretical approach. There have been targeted articles by historians of education like Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who have framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And they started to sort of unpack how it worked from a theoretical perspective. Meanwhile, there had been some researchers at places like UMass and at Virginia Tech who tried to map the Morrill Act footprint of their individual schools and to connect them to indigenous nations. But those approaches hit some snags. None of them were completed. There had also been some schools, places like Iowa State, Michigan State, the University of Nebraska, that began mapping their Morrill Act parcels, but they didn't bother to ask who the land's original owners and caretakers were. And there's more work along these lines coming out, which is all to say that it has recently and only recently become a really exciting time to be thinking about what was until just a few years ago an entirely neglected issue in both the scholarship and in the public memory of land-grant universities. Now, where does the High Country News collaboration come in? This collaboration began in 2018 when my co-author, Tristan Atone, and I, we were both on fellowships at the same university. This was fortunate because I'm a historian, he's a journalist. We tend to run in different circles. And the goal for the project was to unspool the Morrill Act not completely, to not just identify the parcels benefiting a single university or parcels that were located in a single state or came from a single indigenous nation, but to locate all of them insofar as that was possible, and to track down the indigenous origins of every parcel and gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. So that was the goal. And this map that you've been looking at for the past couple of minutes is the result of that effort in its most condensed form. But before I get into what you're looking at here, what it contains, I'll give you a quick sketch of the Morrill Act itself and land-grant universities. Land-grant universities do not start with the Morrill Act of 1862. The United States, early in the 19th century, was starting to fund colleges with land taken from the public domain. States were engaged in this. Places like Michigan State and Pennsylvania State University in the 1850s were really the models for the type of agricultural and mechanical education that land-grant universities would become known for. So what happens in 1862 with the Morrill Act is the nationalization of this idea of this program, turning it from a haphazard group of funding sources into a national program. And the way that scholars have tended to research the history of the Morrill Act and the history of land-grant universities has been in the framework of quote unquote democracy's colleges, often with a question mark after it, asking to what extent land-grant universities realized the ambition of widening education to the industrial and agricultural sons and daughters of middling and lower sorts. The Morrill Act of 1862 comes at a time during the Civil War when you have 3 landmark land laws. There are thousands of land laws passed by the United States. in the 19th century. But 1862 is a high watermark for three of the big ones in quick succession. You have the Homestead Act of 1862, which gives farm-size homesteads to individuals who are willing to live on them for 5 years. You have the Pacific Railroad Act, which gives away these massive checkerboard grants that trace their tracks across the country as they're building the transcontinental railroads. And then you have the Morrill Act, which comes immediately, a few days really after the Pacific Railroad Act is passed. And the Morrill Act is actually the smallest of these sort of big three. It ultimately involved, we found, roughly 10.8 million acres that was distributed to 47 states, which sold this land, they leased the land, and they funneled the endowments that were raised to 52 different universities. There are some states, most states helped or established one land-grant university with these funds. There were 5 states that helped too. Most of these universities are public, like the University of Minnesota. Some are private, like Cornell or MIT. The land came, as I mentioned earlier, ultimately we found from nearly 250 tribes and nations whose land had been taken by the United States through 162 treaties. Most of these ratified, many of them unratified outright land takings. When you look at how much was paid for this land versus how much was raised, and I should add that for many of these parcels, nothing was paid at all. But on average, you had overall about $400,000 was paid to extinguish Indian title, as it was known, through treaties. And off of this, $23 million in principal in the 19th century was raised. That's a ratio of about 57-to-1. So overall, for every $1 the United States pays to acquire title to this land, it's able to deliver $57 in principal into the coffers of land-grant universities. Now, in contemporary dollars, as I mentioned before, this is a principal worth about $500 million in today's money. And I should emphasize that when these colleges and universities are getting this, they are tiny. They have few students. Many are founded to take advantage of this bounty. And what you see here on this map is those nearly 80,000 parcels spread across 24 states and the means to compare them. So you see some pull lines here, one to the Chippewa Treaty of 1837, which contributed more than 1 million acres to 33 land-grant universities. It raised $3.2 million, and it cost the U.S. less than $65,000 to acquire legal title to. The pullouts in Nebraska and in California are areas of particular density. Where these parcels are. In Nebraska, you have lands taken from the Kaw Nation to fund a variety of universities. In California, you have a dense patch that is near the location of the Mariposa War in the 1850s. So how did this work? So step by step, and I should say here that the maps and infographics that you're seeing are the work of Margaret Pierce, the cartographer for the project, who did a wonderful job of visualizing this data. So step by step, how the Morrill Act works, the logistics of it. First, you have Congress makes these offers of this grant land to all of the states and territories as they become states. Now, some of this land that's going to be used has already been acquired from indigenous nations. Some of it is going to be acquired in the future. The grants themselves are going to range in anywhere from 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres, so nearly 1 million acres. And the size depends roughly on the population of the states that they're being doled out to. New York is the largest, most populous state at the time. Technically, these are tied to the size of congressional delegations. It has the largest congressional delegation. It gets nearly 1 million acres. Most other states are allocated about, or the smaller states, Rhode Island, several in the West, are allocated 90,000 acres. I believe Minnesota receives an allocation of 120,000 acres, although I can tell you why they actually receive a little bit less than that later on in the Q&A if you're interested. Now these parcels will range anywhere in size, ultimately from less than an acre to to more than a square mile. And this fourth step here describes the differences in how the land and land right distribution works. It breaks down on an east-west basis, which is what you see below on the slide here. Eastern states, because there is no public domain land within their state boundaries, none left, or there never was any, they receive something called scrip. Now, scrip is sort of like a coupon to select land anywhere on the public domain. 160 acres, one of those squares that you see as you fly over the country. Choose one of those, anyone in the surveyed public domain. So that's why you see Cornell on the right here, New York. Its land selections are ultimately all over the place. Now, Western states have lots of public domain land that's been more recently acquired from indigenous nations within their boundaries. They have to choose land from within their state boundaries. So that's why you see University of California here selecting land within its boundaries. Minnesota is one of these land states. All of the land for Minnesota's grant is going to come from within what are the current boundaries of the state of Minnesota. And then finally, the fifth point here is disposal. The disposal of the land. Most of these states that get scrip are going to sell off the scrip to speculators, who are then going to either sell it on further or put in for the land themselves. Some of these Western states, they set up land offices. The University of California has a land office, and they engage in sort of long-term speculation with the selection and selling of this land. And what you see on the little red pullouts are the types of statistics, overview statistics that you can generate through this data-driven approach of trying to find all of the parcels and connect the entire story together. When you take a closer look, here we are in Arizona. You can see, one of these parcels at work. On the left here is a square mile of Apache land that was selected for the benefit of the University of Arizona. You can zoom in and see it under a satellite image. You can see what's on this. I think I see a baseball field and a football field, some tract housing. We also sent Kaylin Goodluck, the photographer for the project, out to these parcels. Of course, not all of them, but he took a trip around many states in the West to see what was on the ground at these places. And here you see on the right the Apache Tears Motel. And what we do in the story, what you see here, is trying to reconnect the histories of land loss with the creation of university endowments around the country. Now, we also wanted to make the data available that we collected to anyone, even if they're not tech friendly. So we built this website to give access to the full data set, so you could explore it on your own and see what's there. Now, let me play this video here. So you have these university pages, like this one's Cornell you're looking at. They give you a lot of information, things like the founding date, the student enrollment, how many acres a university received. But most importantly, you can sort of play with the maps that we put together. Jeff McGee, who was the designer for the site, and Cody Leff, who was the coder, they developed this site and these maps to let you see the connections between the institutions and the land. You can zoom in and out. You can get really, really detailed. You can go all the way down to the acre. You can slide down to the ground and see what's there. You can fly through. You can locate yourself on the map. Those crosshairs on the side right there, they allow you, the website, to locate you if you enable it. And to find out whether or not you live on one of these parcels or near one of them, or if you work on one of them, or if you've been to one of them. Jeff McGee, he found out that he lived on one of these parcels as we were doing this research. You can check addresses. The search function on the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and to see what's on the parcel. In the case of Cornell, you can really see the massive footprint the institution has across the country, and it gives you a wide array of information to really go through, to sort through. There's a ton of information here to play with. And what it allows you to do is to explore and to construct your own narratives from the data. You have the option to play with the links, to click on state boundaries, to look at university links, or even Indigenous land sessions. Obviously, that information on land sessions is invaluable for a number of applications outside of this project. I'm trying to get to the next slide here. Okay, so if you go state by state, here's Minnesota, right? So for instance, the Morrill Act lands that the University of Minnesota benefited from. Looking here like a exploding, firework, which is how these look when you make these connections. We talk about University of Minnesota's story a little bit in the article. If you turn on the land cession layer, you can quickly visualize where these endowment lands came from. Nearly all of Minnesota's Morrill Act lands source back to the Dakota treaties made in the summer of 1851. Now, in the years following this, Congress unilaterally alters these agreements, delays the annuity payments. The Dakota are facing crop failures in the 1850s, years of exploitation by white traders, encroachment by settlers. In 1862, a faction fights back in what becomes the so-called Dakota War. And that results in the largest mass hanging in US history, an eventual expulsion of the Dakota from the state. Now, 5 weeks after the hanging, Governor Alexander Ramsey, who's the governor at the time, he accepts the Morrill Act windfall. This is January of 1863. So we gathered statistics about that windfall for all the universities. University of Minnesota got the grant in 1868. It involved 94,000 acres, excuse me, that raised nearly $580,000 in principal. The US had paid about $2,000 for the same land. So we're talking about a ratio that you can see down here on the bottom right of about 250 to 1. Now, we asked all the universities for a response before publishing the story, and we posted them on the site. You can see here, University of Minnesota didn't provide one. You can do this for the other states. If you take a look at the University of California, where I got my PhD, for instance, you can get the sort of mile-high view and see all the connections the university has to the Morrill lands. Zoom in on Los Angeles, and you get more detail on the individual parcels. Now, essentially what Cody and Jeff have done here is create pages for each one of these land parcels. That's nearly 80,000 individual pages on the site. So you can get an incredible amount of information, acre by acre, state by state, university by university. So when you zoom in on a parcel in California, you can click and you can go to the parcel page. Now on there, you can see treaty co-signers, when it was acquired by the United States, the gains associated with it. Just with this page, you can start to construct a story about this one very specific piece of land. And because the site works on mobile, you can actually go there, locating yourself on your phone, and check out the actual parcel, which, as I mentioned before, is what Kaylin Goodluck was doing on making the photographs for this piece. And this is how we know that this parcel in Los Angeles is home to the Directors Guild of America. So this comes from more than 7 indigenous nations in California. It's ceded by unratified treaty in 1851. Nothing at all is paid for it. Roughly $788.74 is raised. Here's a private residence in Los Angeles on one of these parcels. Buena Vista, the Castaqui, the Homiyoc, and six other indigenous nations in California were the caretakers of this land, also ceded by unratified treaty in 1851. Here we are in Seattle at the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery, which had been the lands of the Duwamish and Suquamish, ceded by treaty January 22nd, 1855. Was sold for the benefit of the state of South Carolina, specifically for the benefit of Clemson University and South Carolina State University. Raised about $58, cost the United States a little less than $4. Here's those cornfields in Adams, Nebraska, land of the Kaw Nation, ceded in 1825, sold for the benefit of the Ohio State University, raised about $88, cost the United States less than $1. And here's Minnesota. This is El Rosa, Minnesota. This was land ceded by the Dakota in the Treaty of 1851 that I mentioned earlier, raised nearly $1,000, cost the U.S. less than $4. And here you can see the sort of how it's being used today as a scrapyard. And there's still even more work to be done in this area. Or last summer, I should say, we reported that at least 16 land-grant universities, nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres. That brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue combined in fiscal year 2019 alone. That's 1 year. It remains unknown. I really need to stress this. We do not know how much the Morrill Act lands have earned for universities over time. No one knows this. It's waiting to be figured out. But the data that we did collect to jumpstart this body of research is all made freely available for download online. It's all on GitHub. So you can think of the project as sort of like 3 levels of curation. There's the story the article where we give the overview of the project and we start drawing connections between dispossession and the creation of land-grant universities. Of course, we can't cover everything in the story, so the website allows you to sort of choose your own adventure going through the data in a sort of in a non-technical way. But it's the data itself made available on GitHub that allows users the most independence to download the material. There's a lot more stuff in here than is even on the website to be able to build off of what we've done. It was really important for the project to make this an open source data set, so others could take this research in new and important directions. Excuse me. So to aid that, what you see here is the user guide that we put together that puts all the contents of the geodatabase into plain language. And here's a table of the data. I feel like this group is more technically oriented, so you can see really how simple this is. For the most part, if you work in GIS, that's fine. You can work with the polygon files. If you don't, you can access the vast majority of this data with Excel on your laptop, and you can dig through it and you can sift through it, and you can find your own stories to tell and your own pathways through the data. And you can check what we've done. This is also as a sort of scholarly apparatus. It's important for us to put all our work and resources out there. Now, what lies behind this? Let me show you some stuff from Minnesota. So behind these tables that we've painstakingly put together through digital extraction, through transcription, ultimately are documents like this one. So this is a land selection list from Minnesota. It describes the location of individual parcels and their rough appraisal value in the 1860s. If you look at the bottom right over here, you can see them broken up into into county areas. Anywhere from $5 to $10 appraisal. This is land that's acquired for a few cents just a decade before. This isn't appreciation over that brief period. This is wealth extraction through settler colonialism. That's what you're seeing here in these sort of dry documents, translating them onto maps to be able to reconstruct the connection between universities and indigenous people was what we were after with these documents. There's material like this. This is a state report showing the actual prices received in Minnesota year by year in the late 19th century. It took about 40 years for the state to dispose of all the Morrill Act lands that enriched the University of Minnesota. This is all publicly available material. These are state reports. And so what has happened since we published this story last year? We published in March 31st of 2020, so it's been a little over a year. So what Land Grab Universities has done is it started a public conversation on the debts universities owe to Indigenous communities. There are a number of ways in which we've seen researchers and reporters engage in the work, and each is unique to the institution and the communities involved. So first, let's take a look at some of the coverage. There have been 3 areas we've seen reporters play in when it comes to taking on the story. So they've been localizing the story, they've been contextualizing the story, and they've been adapting the story and the data. The investigative news outlet, Ion Ohio, which produced what you're looking at here, mapped all the lands that supported Ohio, the Ohio State University. That's more than 614,000 acres spread out over 14 states. They used the land grab data in order to do this, in order to highlight that the U.S. paid about $35,000 for this land that benefited the university, and it raised about $340,000, so a return nearly 10 times the purchase amount. When adjusted for inflation, the U.S. would have paid about $1 million in current dollars for this mass of broken up land. And the university would have raised about $6.8 million. It's a good example of how reporters in one state could provide extra detail and localized analysis of the story. Here is a timeline put together by Fox. Sorry, not Fox, Vox, using the data. I'd be surprised to see this on Fox. Then there's, so this was produced by journalism students at the University of Missouri. And so Vox looked specifically at Mizzou's footprint, Morrill Act footprint, and its relationship to the Indigenous communities that it received land from, which was the Osage in this case. And using these simple timelines, what they did was they added context to the data, revealing that through miscommunication, deceptive practices, the Osage ceded all of their land to the federal government and were forced to move to Oklahoma, making the land available to the University of Missouri. Finally, there are stories that go beyond the data, like this one from Scalawag magazine, going beyond the data that we collected and employing the methodology that we developed. In September of last year, Scalawag magazine revealed that Southern universities funded their early years through the sale of land expropriated from Indigenous communities. The University of North Carolina, of which you can see in this map, took more than 200,000 acres of Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were gained through obtained through Indian removal. They also found that more than 30% of UNC's annual budget was comprised of land sales between 1818 and 1840. Now, this is before the Morrill Act became law. In terms of institutional change, we're starting to see some movement there as well. So almost directly after publication of this story, the University of Florida's Student Senate demanded the assembly of a working group to examine UF's connections to Indigenous expropriation and slavery in order to better understand and document the university's history. Students at Cornell, which you see on the right here, they likewise formulated a list of demands for how the university could better serve its Indigenous students. We've also seen some similar moves at Washington State University, Pullman, which actually rewrote its land acknowledgement using the project data and pledged to commission a team to determine reconciliation plans. Something similar is going on with Texas A&M, who's working toward assembling a task force to better understand the history of the Morrill Act for their institution as well. Another response we've seen are conferences and teach-ins. At UC Berkeley, for example, there was a 2-day symposium held last fall to explore and address the university's responsibility to Indigenous communities in California. The meeting included nearly 24 speakers. It had breakout sessions to deal with calls to action, inspirations for accountability, and analysis, particularly around issues related to land returns and the mechanics, as well as past examples of how land returns but have functioned in the context of cities, states, churches, and the federal government. We've also seen some really important, I think, research initiatives emerging at universities. At Cornell, which was, I mentioned, the largest Morrill Act beneficiary, staff and faculty launched a project to document the university's financial windfall through a regularly updated and dedicated site, Cornell University and Indigenous Dispossession Project. You can check it out online. Now, the goal here is to present as much factual information about Cornell's parcels and to determine and consult with tribes impacted by Cornell to determine what possible remedies there might be. We've seen something similar at Ohio State, where another initiative is underway. In this case, Ohio State has announced that it's working in partnership with the First Nations Development Institute to begin conversations with affected tribes and to begin to determine an appropriate path forward and develop an understanding of specific reparative actions that would benefit Indigenous communities connected to the university. The work, of course, is expected to take time, but it could represent one of the most comprehensive attempts at reconciliation plans taken by a university in regards to impacted communities to date. There are additional initiatives underway at the University of Arizona, at Utah State, at MIT. There's a program at University of Connecticut that's going to be called Land Grab Yukon. And I've heard whispers about activities at the University of Minnesota, but I'm not really privy to them. So if anyone in the audience today knows more about it, I'd love to hear about what's going on there. The reaction has really been from the bottom up, so it's not a centralized or coordinated across universities. So these have just been a sort of handful of some of the major moves that we've seen since publication, and each sort of speaks to the unique characteristics of the communities involved. So what I've given today is sort of a brief overview of the project. And I would be grateful to talk about it more with you and to take any questions that you might have about the project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee. That was a wonderful talk and very insightful. First question, more just a question about the website and the map, is are the long white lines crossing the U.S. ceded to the railroads?
The long white lines, can I get some more detail? Are you talking about on the front page when you first click on the website?
This is from Michael Wilson. I don't know if you have any more context to that question, Michael.
Well, I think what Michael is getting at is when you first, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is when you first go onto the web page, on the right hand side there is an image of North America, the U.S. portion of it, with a lot of white lines sort of crossing back and forth across it. And asking, and the question is those are the railroad lines. No, they are not.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about on the map of North America that you showed, that showed the lands in some detail. In Michigan, for example, there are these really straight white lines that cross through, I think it was the purple colored area.
This one?
We can't see your screen right
sorry.
now.
Let me share it back up on the screen. Are you referring to this map?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, no, the white lines are the land cession boundaries. Those are Indigenous land cession boundaries. So for the most part,
those long straight white lines going across northern Michigan are,
these are all the white lines on the map are land cession boundaries.
He's talking about the white space between the purple space that looks like lines in Michigan.
Well, we'd have to zoom in. That might just be space between parcels. it could be that land was, I don't know the exact history of those particular pathways. It could be that they're connected to some type of infrastructure. The land was already taken, for instance. You couldn't you couldn't choose land that had been allocated to individuals or corporations or states. So that could be that could be the case for why there are those corridors that you see there. But I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
There are several good resources that have been posted in the chat. For example, one is a book from the Dakota Perspective on Minnesota History by Waziawatin, as well as Forest Service information, and another book correcting and documenting a lot of Minnesota history and treaties that others in the audience or Dr. Lee might find useful. Does anyone have questions that they'd like to unmute themselves to ask?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. So a lot of this work is centered around, bringing Native people back into this conversation of, or saying that the investments made by universities are kind of done on the backs of Native folk. So what have you all done in this project to kind of include Native voices and Native scientists and data collectors and historians and all that?
Yeah, I mean, during the investigation of this project, I mean, I should say I'm not an Indigenous person. The team was a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. But in terms of outreach, one of the real challenges with this story was figuring out a way to tell it. So part of the investigative reporting side of this project was reaching out to a number of the nations whose land was expropriated and reused for this purpose. What we found again and again as we contacted tribal historic preservation offices and leaders in these communities is that they wanted to see what we had. They wanted to see what the material was altogether first. So we I mean this side of the story of what happened to this land is generally unknown to Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people alike. So we encountered again and again people saying, well, we need to see the whole picture in order to figure out what's going on before we can make a response to it. So that's what the project became about, providing that initial picture. And now what we've been going through is speaking with various organizations, not just at universities, but with community organizers, with student groups, Indigenous students in STEM, and have been sort of raising awareness about this material. And what we've seen at a lot of the universities who are picking up this material is efforts to connect the specific data points to their specific university stories. So that's the next step where I think this research in this area is going.
Another question is, are there any examples in the US or elsewhere of just land transfers? For example, purchase of land from Indigenous people at a fair market price without coercion?
There's not, I mean, there is a range of ways in which the United States obtains land, and none of them are totally without coercion. What we're talking about is a spectrum here of communities assessing their needs and deciding to do something like sign a treaty, but it's done within the context of settler colonialism and unequal power relations. So for many of these treaties are legally signed and paid for. Many are broken. along the way. The majority of them are broken. One of the important data sources for this story was the Indian Claims Commission in the 20th century, which assessed the sort of history of broken treaties. So, I mean, the answer really, I think, is not really no. I mean, there's not an absence of coercion in the process of the United States, at least in its program of land acquisition from the 1780s forward.
Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, University of Minnesota Morris has a history of being a residential school. And they have a policy in place where American Indian students can attend tuition free. Have you heard of any universities who've uncovered what you've uncovered, considering such a move as one tiny way of atoning for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are other universities that have free tuition for Native students around the U.S. There are a number of them. The one move in this, I mean, what we have seen, I didn't talk about, there was one of the more important, I think, reactions to the piece was a policy brief coming out saying exactly this. That Native American students should either receive free tuition at land-grant universities or the land should be returned. And that's the argument made in this policy brief. In terms of action on that front, the closest thing that I've seen is at Colorado, at Colorado State, where there is a move to not provide free, tuition remission, but to provide in-state tuition to out-of-state students. And that's the only move I've seen in that direction. That's a concrete step.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. Mike, I see your hand is raised.
Sure, thank you. This is great. Really a pleasure to hear your talk here. Obviously, this has been a huge project and has had major impacts, I think, on all of us. So I just want to commend you for that. You asked about University of Minnesota. University actually 2 weeks ago established a commission called Truth, and that's in conjunction with the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, which is a state agency that's comprised of 10 of the 11 federally recognized tribal chair people. And each tribe is going to dig into this kind of history. They're using some funds to hire historians, etc. The university, myself included, is people like me. I do history and tribal natural resource management issues. Several of us, American Indian Studies from the different campuses, are involved in that to really dig into a number of issues, including this land grant, where did the lands come from, et cetera, especially with our Dakota presence here. And if you look at the state, we've got large Ojibwe reservations in the north, but you don't see large Dakota reservations. And that's a legacy of that genocide, removal, land theft, et cetera. And we can see that playing out across the landscape. I think I was going to say one more thing. Oh, I put a link on the Forest Service. I think it might really be nice, because one of the things that does, it shows every single treaty. It shows the original maps of those treaties, but it also shows the name of the tribe today. So I think you can then start thinking about who are the tribes that you would really need to work with to talk to around some of these land issues. So thanks a lot.
No, thank you for that. And I have a couple of responses there. The U.S. Forest Service data, that's what we used here for the sessions. But we had long and difficult discussions about how to identify the nations involved. Ultimately, we took what was a more conservative approach, using the names that were signed on the treaties themselves. It was a historical process with the hope that Native nations know their histories, and they know which treaties they're connected to. And part of the reason was for that because the U.S. Forest Service work on identifying the current the current legal names of the nations involved is not complete. Especially there's no entries, for example, in California. They make no effort to identify the current nations, and this is wrapped up with federally recognized status, non-recognized status. So since we couldn't do it for all without adding X years to the project, we didn't want to do it for any. But we did use that U.S. Forest Service data. There's been a number of efforts. I mean, there are also problems with the Forest Service data. This is all based on the Royce maps from the 1890s, and it's just transposed. There's actually a real need for renewed basic geospatial review to reassess the historical boundaries of the sessions from the 18th century forward. Actually, I mean from the 15th century forward. It's necessary, but it becomes even much more difficult once you get into the 17th, 16th century. Yeah, so no, I mean in order to do a data project like this, you have to pick and choose about the type of material that you can do the original research on. So our original research was figuring out the parcels, being able to generate a list of the parcels that could be used to layer on to pre-existing maps of indigenous land cessions and other pre-existing data sources that we used to put this all together. That's on the last point. On the earlier one, that's great to hear about Minnesota. I'd heard that there was something in the works, but I haven't seen an announcement. I'd love to see when an official announcement comes out. I'd love to see it. I'd love to read it. We're trying to keep a log of everything that's happening to make the Land Grab University's website not just a sort of time capsule of a project, but as a hub for ongoing work. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to periodically update it with activities that have been happening in the wake of this research, especially I think because there's a need to start to connect people at different universities that are starting to do this work. The project that you've described sounds like it has some similarities to what's going on at Ohio State. I was at the University of Wisconsin recently. They're also thinking about how to develop a formal response. A number of universities at sort of different levels, going from rethinking land acknowledgements to developing new Native student centers. All of these discussions are happening, and I mean, whenever I go and give these talks, I always hear like new great ideas from people in the audience. And I mean, that was the hope, to sort of put this material out there, because I mean, it was a large project, but we've done a tiny amount of work on this issue. So it's more like trying to crack open a door and get the sort of start the ball in motion, right? That takes a hard push, but it doesn't do all the work. So there's a lot more. We just sort of have the tip of the iceberg here. Really, I mean, what you were looking at the map before is like the view from 30,000 feet, and we need to figure out what was really happening on the ground.
Marie is wondering what's going on with the land grant universities in Alaska, Hawaii, and Oklahoma, whether they're different type of land grant university or what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. It took us a long time to figure out that we shouldn't include Oklahoma, not because it doesn't have a land grant university, not because it didn't receive land from indigenous nations to build endowments, but the way that we constructed this as a research project. The question was, what is all the land that was distributed under the authority of the Morrill Act of 1862? And so Oklahoma gets land for land grant universities, but technically it's under a different law passed in the early 20th century, whereas other territories turned states had this grandfathered in through their enabling acts. There was a process in place where this was for agricultural colleges. This is what they were. This was the parlance in the 19th century. So technically, Oklahoma, although they have a very glossy drone footage, celebration video of their land grant university status on their website. We contacted them about it. They got back to us and said, no, we're not a Morrill Act of 1862 university for the purposes of this research. So we left them out, not because there isn't a story to be told there, and there's some people working on that. I just spoke with a journalist in Alaska who's also talking about what's going on in Alaska with the University of Alaska trying to get additional land for its land grant university because Alaska was also excluded from the, it has a land grant university, but it was excluded from the usual practice of grandfathering in the Morrill Act through the Enabling Act of, so in what is it, 59, when Alaska becomes a state, the state gets a sort of a lump sum of land. It's not disaggregated for different purposes. Like there's not a group of land that's associated for the land grant university specifically. And the state, the university, has been angry for many years that it has the lowest amount. It's the largest state with the lowest amount of land received for its land grant university. Now, Hawaii is a different situation altogether, and it's similar to the territorial land grant universities on territorial islands. So Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, University of Hawaii, all in the second half of the 20th century become land grant universities, but they are all allocated cash endowments. Rather than land. So they have a land grant university. What happens to land grant university as an idea in the 20th century is it transitions away from being this like very direct, like land grant university means we give land for a university, to being a status that qualifies a group, a class of universities for streams of federal funding. So even if you're a land grant university that has never received any land, there is value in gaining the status of land grant universities for becoming eligible for certain funding streams. It's similar as well on tribal colleges. A number of tribal colleges were made land grant universities, land grant colleges in the 1990s, and since expanded. They're similar to Hawaii and the territorial universities in that they received cash endowments, no land.
I see we're at 1 o'clock. I'm hoping, Dr. Lee, you could stick around for a few more questions if that's all right.
Yeah.
But for those of you that have to go, you can find this seminar and future seminars and past seminars all on the website of the Conservation Sciences Seminar. So I see your hand up, Hussein, go ahead.
Unmute. Okay. Yeah. Another question, and this one might be a little bit more out there, so feel free to say you don't really know. But something that I feel has come out of this project has been a lot of people when they're giving talks and seminars, they'll start their talk or seminar with, my university is a land grab university, and these are kind of the people that we took land from. But that's more or less where the conversation around that ends. Do you have any advice to, and it might come back to some of the things you were saying earlier that these universities are doing, making these, student groups and these tuition things and all this stuff, but do you have any advice on how you can take it beyond just a kind of a blanket statement on we're a land grab university and into something more productive?
Yeah, I mean, that's not an out there question, but it's a really difficult question. Before I attempt to at least give my answer, I just wanted to ask if Wes would grab the links and on the chat that is being produced. Maybe
yep, we can send that chat history to you.
I'd love to see this stuff and be able to look at it more closely. And yeah, I totally on the question of land acknowledgements. Part of this research was, land acknowledgements are incredibly complicated in themselves. Part of the goal of this research was to complicate land acknowledgements even further, to point out, as we put it in the piece, that these universities are not just built on Indigenous land; they're built with Indigenous land that's been capitalized and turned into endowments. And those connections can be really difficult to see in a way that it's different to be able to, with the tools that we have now to, quickly, look up on your phone whose land you're standing on, so you can give a quick land acknowledgement at the beginning. Now, there's been a tremendous amount of criticism, warranted criticism, of land acknowledgements as a practice, as a performative practice that becomes problematic when it's conceived exactly as you say, as a last step rather than a first step. I mean, land acknowledgements have to be the first step. I mean, when thinking about, what is the what could be done in response to this research, I always say acknowledging what happened, how things work, how we got to now is the first step. But if you don't put material change behind that, if that doesn't spur any changes of everyday practice, and particularly of the allocation of resources, then it's performative rhetoric that doesn't change much. The things that are much harder to do are the things that really cost time and effort, and to think and cause people to think about how they allocate the scarce resources of a university.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking this time out of your evening or afternoon, Dr. Lee. This has been super insightful, and it's really fantastic to see your talk, I guess, almost a year after your groundbreaking article came out.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation and for all the questions and for sitting through the Zoom talk. I know we're all looking forward to this being over, but it's actually been great for me as an academic based in the UK to be able to talk to a lot of audiences that I just normally wouldn't be able to. So I'm very, very thankful for the invitation and for the technology that has made it possible. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope you have the opportunity to talk to more conservation programs as well.